Let's go ahead and talk about inflation. This is just sort of a interesting little side note. It's relevant to our discussion of how to account for subsidiaries in highly inflationary economies. This is just a little bit of historical background. Probably the best known example of hyperinflation in the past 100 years was the case of post-World War I Germany and to a lesser extent Austria. And here's a chart of the exchange rate between the German mark to the British pound in the first column, or actually the first column is the years. The middle column, German marks to the British pound versus, and also German marks to the US dollar. Now back prior to World War I, most of the um, industrial or commercialized world was on the gold standard, which essentially resulted in fixed exchange rates because each currency was defined as a certain quantity of gold. And prior to World War I, looking at the far right-hand column, the dollar was worth about 4 marks. A mark was worth about 25 cents. And that stayed pretty much the same. It rose a little bit through World War I, 1915, 1916, 1917, because um, all the belligerent countries, with the exception of the U.S., went off the gold standard, basically printing money in order to finance the war. After World War I, we see the exchange rate start to rise substantially. February 1920, the mark went to 100 marks to the dollar. It dipped a little bit through 1920, and then it started going up, sort of parabolically. Um, by October of 1921, the rate was about 150 to the dollar, going up to 200 to the dollar, 300 to the dollar, 600 to the dollar, 6,000 to the dollar, 57,000 to the dollar. By the time you get to 1923, you see what's happening. In August of 1923, the exchange rate was between 900,000 to 11.4 million marks to the dollar. October of 1923, 250 million to 170 milliard marks to the dollar. Now, just a historical curiosity, they used to refer to what we now call a billion as a milliard. So looking at this chart, a milliard is a billion, and a billion is a trillion in today's usage. But in any event, you see that by January of 1924, the exchange rate had gone from 4 marks to the dollar to 4.47 trillion marks to the dollar. Now, if you're a business, how do you account for transactions when the value of your currency, the measuring stick of your economic activities, is no longer a decent measuring stick? Similar, visual is the price of gold in German marks. And again, immediately after World War I, January 1919, it took 170 marks to buy an ounce of gold. And again, that rose progressively over the years, looking to 1923, 372,000 marks, 270 million marks, 6.6 billion marks, 25 billion marks, 85 billion marks, 1.16 trillion marks, up to a high of 87 trillion marks to buy an ounce of gold. Now, when you print money to that extent, what can you do with money? Well, you can make little castles out of wads of cash. You could sell it as scrap paper. And the bankers, of course, could devote their entire working lives to counting money, just mountains and mountains and mountains of money. If you Google, um, Germany hyperinflation or Weimar, Weimar hyperinflation, you come up with a lot of images like this. People using it to feed their wood stoves, people using it as wallpaper, kids making kites out of it. It becomes worthless. And again, just the idea of how this affects our measurement of transactions. The price of bread. During and immediately after World War I, loaf of bread was about 1 mark, and again, that was about 25 cents U.S. And it rose, obviously substantially as the value of the mark plummeted. Here are some of the big historical winners in the inflation race, and the granddaddy of them all was Hungary after World War II. July 1946, their highest monthly inflation rate was 4.19 times 10 to the 16th, so 4 with 16 zeros after it, and I believe that's about 42 quadrillion percent per month. Equivalent daily rate 270%, 7%, and it took about 15 hours for prices to double. The most famous recent example was Zimbabwe. They had hyperinflation. Yugoslavia also after the Balkan troubles, the breakup of Yugoslavia, the Serbian conflict. Germany after World War One, Greece after World War Two, China after the glorious People's Revolution. Um, and the middle class gets wiped out. Imagine yourself as an elderly person who's worked hard all your life and saved responsibly. Your savings of 100,000 marks, which prior to the war would have carried you through a long and happy retirement, is now essentially worthless. And here we have a picture of some respectable housefraus selling off their cherished possessions, to buy that 200 billion mark loaf of bread. Um, and there's a rather robust market in currency from various hyperinflationary economies. And I'm sure a lot of it's counterfeit, but if you're counterfeiting something that's worthless, I'm not sure what the point is. But as a collector's item, here is a 100 mark note from before the war or immediately after the war, before the hyperinflation, and you replace that with a 10 billion mark. And again, under the old usage, that's termed a 10 billion. In today's usage, that would be a 10 trillion mark note. The Hungarian Pengo, same thing. After World War II, we have our 100 Pengo note and our billion or milliard Pengo note. Yugoslavia, this one's sort of sad, or they're all sad. This nice young lady, prior to about 1993, on the 10 dinar note. A few years later, the nice young lady on the the billion dinar note. And the granddaddy of them all, of course, the 500 billion dinar Yugoslavian note. A recent case in our own hemisphere is the case of Nicaragua. If you recall, back in the 70s into the early 80s, they had the glorious People's Revolution where the Sandinistas took over from the admittedly evil Somoza, and they established their workers' paradise. And here, of course, is Comandante Carlos Fonseca Amador on the 10 Cordoba note. To finance the glorious People's Paradise, they printed money, like many do, and they suffered the inevitable effects of high inflation. And so just a year or so later, here we have the 500,000 Cordoba note with Comandante Germán Pomares Ordóñez on it. And if you look at this carefully, you'll see that originally it was a 20 Cordoba note. Inflation was so high that they simply ran it through the printer again and overwrote it with 500,000 Cordobas. The Cordoba was first revalued in 1988, where people traded in 1,000 in old Cordoba notes for one new Cordoba note. And then a mere 3 years later, in 1991, it was revalued again, and people traded in 5 million of the old, I guess now new old, Cordoba for one new one. So that means that in the short span of 3 years, the Cordoba fell to 1/5 billionth of its value from a few years prior. The example of Nicaragua doesn't get much press, largely because, again, this was the glorious People's Revolution, throwing off the evil bonds of the evil capitalists. But again, any sort of collectivist economic planning generally exhibits the level of economic knowledge of a 3-year-old, and this is the inevitable result. And of course, the most recent case, Zimbabwe. Their notes up to $100 trillion in value. They're still dealing with this to an extent. People obviously have trillions or quadrillions of these notes in their possession, and rather than being completely and utterly worthless, the People's Bank of Zimbabwe, the Central Bank of Zimbabwe, is going to redeem these things. And I think the conversion ratio is for 35 trillion Zimbabwean dollars, you're going to get $1 US, or something to that effect. And of course, there's the old joke about how do you ruin perfectly good paper and ink? You give it to the government to print into money. And just as sort of the sobering afterthought, this is a picture of the total assets of the Federal Reserve. That first spike back, in 2008, where the assets of the Fed jumped from 900 billion up to about 2.2 trillion. That was the start of the financial crisis. Um, and here's another graph, the St. Louis adjusted monetary base, and sort of the same visual. It was fairly flat and stable up until the 60s and 70s. 1971, we disconnected the dollar from gold under the Bretton Woods Agreement, and the monetary base started rising substantially as the government or as the Fed simply digitizes or prints digitally the money that they want to distribute to ostensibly stimulate the economy. And then, of course, we see the meteoric rise in 2009 during the financial crisis. Now, what, you may ask, does all of this have to do with us? Um, Imagine that you have a subsidiary based in Venezuela, currently one of the more inflation-prone economies, and you've been dutifully translating their trial balance into US dollars each year. Now, if there is, or is the expectation of, high inflation, then the exchange rate for the Venezuelan bolivar will drop substantially, because if there's high inflation, that means the bolivar will buy less, which means the bolivar itself is worth less. Now, this is a graph of the exchange rate, US dollar versus Venezuelan bolivar, over the past 5 years or so. The red line down at the bottom, which almost looks like the x-axis of the graph, that's the official exchange rate. The blue line that rises is the black market rate, the implied rate for the currency. And that's usually the case in most command economies. Um, if they don't like the way the exchange rate is behaving, they simply decree that the exchange rate is thus, um, basically trying to trump laws of economics. In any event, what do we do if we've got a subsidiary in a highly inflationary economy? Now, on this year's subsidiary's balance sheet, there may be equipment purchased 5 years ago, back when the exchange rate was about 8 to 1, that was bought for 1,000,000 bolivars. And at that time, that was worth about $125,000. Now, that asset is still a valuable economic resource, still producing whatever it is that it produces. Now, if the exchange rate has changed so that it's now 400 bolivars to the dollar, then when we go to translate that property, plant, and equipment, we'll use the end of year exchange rate as we're supposed to, and that equipment is only going to be reported at $2,500. Again, the equipment still has substantial economic value as a productive resource. It's just that the historical cost reference, the historical exchange rate, the historical cost reference translated at the current exchange rate isn't a relevant measure of value. So in the case of subsidiaries in highly inflationary economies, the FASB requires that we no longer use the current rate method or translation, but instead switch to the temporal rate method, remeasurement. This means that in the case of non-financial assets like our equipment, we're going to go ahead and use the historical exchange rate that was in effect when that asset was acquired, because that's, basically we're saying, look, the bolivar is no longer a consistent measure of value. We're going to go ahead and measure the value of these resources based upon what their dollar value was when they were acquired. Now, what is a highly inflationary economy? The FASB defines a highly inflationary economy as one where the 3-year cumulative or compound inflation rate exceeds 100%.